So an essential argument that Black Orientalists make is that Black Orientalists, they say that Arabs enslaved Black people just like the white man enslaved Black people. And just like the white man forced his Christianity upon Black people, Islam is not a religion for Black people because it was forced upon us by the Arab slave master. So, brother, for our listening audience, for those who didn't catch the last program, just briefly introduce yourself, as well as, just address that essential claim that many Black Orientalists assert.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Shareef Muhammad. Thank you for having me back. This issue of the Arab slave trade is a polemic that doesn't die, no matter how much clarity is brought to the subject, no matter how many facts are put on the table.
All right, just keep going from where you were at.
Okay. So I was saying that the Arab slave trade is a polemic, just like the spread of Islam into Africa or throughout the world is a polemic. A polemic is a controversial issue that is more political than it is an academic or scholarly issue. And most people who talk about this, they bring their politics and their emotions into it, and facts are sort of, incidental ornaments that, sometimes they're acknowledged, sometimes they're not, but people have their positions, and those positions become more important than the truth. Afrocentrists and the conscious community are never clear on what time period or region they are referring when they use the term, quote, Arab slave trade. There were African slaves in Arabia since before the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, during the reign of Abyssinia and over the Arabian Peninsula as far back as 330 ACE. Okay, there was what's called the Year of the Elephant, which is approximately 570 ACE, which is the year in which it said that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was born, in which the Ethiopian Negus, or king at the time, Abraha, tried to invade Mecca and was defeated. And this defeat resulted in the Arabs capturing Ethiopians and making them slaves in the Arabian Peninsula. This is reportedly how Bilal ibn Rabah, radiallahu anhu, ended up in the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, the first instance in which Arab Muslims took African slaves was when it was part of the terms of what's called the Bakt Treaty. Okay, the Bakt Treaty, B-A-Q-T. And the Bakt Treaty was a treaty that was made after the Muslims took control of Egypt and they got greedy and tried to press south into Nubia in the area today known as, I think, Darfur. I'm not for certain. But the treaty was between the Muslims of Egypt, and at that time the Sultan was Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh, who was the Sultan of Egypt at the time, and the Christian king of Makuria, who was, I think his name was Calidora, also known as Calidosus. So that treaty happened when the Muslims tried to push south into Nubia. They were defeated and beaten back and they were forced to accept this armistice, okay? And, there are different terms that are outlined in the treaty, the Bakt Treaty, but one of the terms was that in exchange for an end to the war, the Nubians would offer to pay the Muslims 360 slaves per annum. That's approximately one slave every day of the calendrial year. What's important about the Bakt Treaty is that it exposes the lie that Muslims introduced the slave trade when the Arabs invaded sub-Saharan Africa. This was the first and last attempt or time that the Arabs tried to invade sub-Sahara, and they failed. Number one. Number two, it was also the Nubians who set the terms of the treaty, making them the initiators of this exchange in slaves. So the first instance where we have of Muslims actually taking African slaves was one that involved a sovereign African kingdom, that was stronger than the Muslims were at the time, defeated them in battle, and as a peace offering gave them their slaves. That's the first instance. There was no invasion. There's, of course, the Indian Ocean trade, okay, between East Africa and Asia. The main agents of that trade were, this is where the language Swahili comes from. Interestingly enough, Afrocentrics don't have a problem with making Swahili the sort of official language of Afrocentrism. And yet Swahili was created for the purpose of this Indian Ocean trade. But the Indian Ocean trade between East Africa and Asia had as its main agents the African tribal leaders, Indians, who were the middlemen, and Persians and some Arabs. And this is how slaves, for example, ended up in Baghdad, in the area of Basra, to sort of clear the salt marshes, which later led to the slave uprisings known as the Zanji uprisings between 869 and 883 ACE. But the point here is that the slave owners were Persian mostly and not Arab, as was the case throughout most of the so-called Arab slave trade. Throughout most of the so-called Arab slave trade, the enslavers were either Persian or Turkish. These slave traders did not bring Islam into Africa or to Africans, because Islam had already been firmly established on the continent for over a century by this time. And so the Indian Ocean trade, which was part of a wider trade in East African products, ivory, soapstone, gold, and yes, slaves, but there were spikes of slave raiding, such as, what we call the Black Muslim sellout, Tipu Tip, in the late 1800s. But he was a sort of consequence of this slave trade. He wasn't the initiator of it, okay? For in reality, slaves were not the central part of this trade, this Indian Ocean trade, over the duration of its existence, which actually predated Islam. The Muslims just came into possession of it when they conquered Persia, but it had been in existence long before that, in which Africans were doing business with Hindus and many others. Now, beyond these three events, the Arab slave trade was largely non-Arab, in which most of the slaves were Europeans, or as would be the slave owners, or in the case would be the slave owners, were Turks. The Turks were slaves to the Arabs under the Abbasid Caliphate and employed as soldiers. Okay, the Abbasid were probably one of the last great Arab caliphates, used these Turks as military personnel. And in fact, the supremacy which the Abbasid Caliphate had militarily over everyone else in the Middle East, North Africa, and Eastern Europe, gave the Abbasids, gave the Turks a sense of, or gave the Turks a status within the Arab world that factored into the sense that whites were superior to Africans among many of the Arabs at that time. So, but the main slaves, my point here is that the main slaves in the Arab world were European. And of course, these Turks revolted against their Arab masters, and they would go on to establish the Ottoman Empire. After the Ottomans lost the war in Crimea in their attempt to take over Eastern Europe, they then turned to Africa, where they tried to finance their second attempt, and this launched their trafficking of African slaves. So, there are three important facts that come out of our examination of the, quote, Arab slave trade, okay? And these three facts are that, one, unlike European conquest and occupation, the Arabs were overthrown and replaced by the very people they subjugated and enslaved. The Arabs ceased to be a dominant political force in the Muslim world around the late 7th century. The people who would go on to sort of carry the banner of Islam and raise it even higher than the Arabs were the very people that the Arabs subjugated, like the Turks, like the Persians, okay? So that's number one. Number two, there was no organized enterprise to transport as many Africans as possible into the Arab heartland in order to build up these countries so that in turn they would become these wealthy Middle Eastern kingdoms, and Africa would, as a consequence, be poor. Whatever exchange in slaves took place between African countries and Arab countries would have had to have the consent of those African rulers, because we always negotiated with Arabs and everyone else from a position of strength, and in the case of the Bakt Treaty, a position of dominance. There was no. And on this part, this is what is so sort of comical and confusing about Chancellor Williams' cover art for his book, Destruction of Civilization, where it has, I guess, it's supposed to be some, pale-skinned invader on a horse coming in and attacking Africa. I don't know what this is referring to exactly. I really don't. I don't know if it's referring to the invasion of Songhai by the Berbers, which happened after the Spanish Inquisition. But this idea of Arabs coming into Africa and just taking over and imposing Islam is historical Afrocentrist fiction. Okay? So the third point is that the Arab slave trade was not limited to Africans, but the number of European slaves from Asia and Anatolia dwarfed the number of black Africans, which is what accounts for why so many Arabs are much lighter in complexion today than their ancestors. There was, and let me say this about slavery in the Arab world. We distinguish between slave societies and societies with slaves. There is a difference. The United States of America and colonial America were slave societies. These were societies where slavery was central to the economic, political, and one would say social development of the country and the society. Societies with slaves were societies in which slavery was an aspect of the society, but the society did not lean on the institution of slavery. And there is not a single Arab society that focused on African slaves, that had a predominance of African slaves, that you would call a slave society. There was no industrial or agrarian capitalist economy that would require slavery on the large scale, as in the case of Europe and colonial America. So, in summation, Arab societies were not slave societies. They were societies with slaves, black and white.
And I think what you mentioned, Chancellor Williams, The Destruction of Black Civilization, and within that book is unresolved contradiction. So at one point, Chancellor Williams, for example, says that black people are Muslim and have Arabic names as a direct result of the quote unquote Arab slave trade. And some people even use the term Islamic slave trade. Many Orientalists use that term. But elsewhere in Chancellor Williams' book, he also says this: it may not be without significance that the Renaissance in Africa occurred at the same time it developed in Europe between the 15th and 16th centuries, and that both in Europe and Africa, Islamic sources were the catalyst. And so, Chancellor Williams even credits Islamic sources as being a catalyst for a Renaissance within Africa, while simultaneously blaming Islam for the quote-unquote Arab subjugation of black people.